The Young and the Restless spoilers Fridays November 28, 2025. Sharon Newman had always been a woman who trusted her instincts, and those instincts were rarely wrong, especially when danger lurked beneath the surface of Genoa City. So when she watched Tam Two Burrows walk out of Crimson Lights yet again with that same clipped tone, that same evasive stare, that same empty promise that the investigation was moving forward, something inside her tightened. She didn't believe him. Not for a second. The disappearance of Noah had already fractured her heart, and the rising chaos surrounding Claire and Kyle had wrapped the entire Newman Abbott world in a suffocating fog. Sharon could feel the tension settling into her bones, crawling under her skin like a warning. Detective Burrows wasn't doing his job, not properly, not honestly, and Sharon refused to sit quietly while the truth remained buried under procedural excuses and bureaucratic fog. Her distrust grew sharper each time she saw the detective glance over evidence as if he were pretending to search, pretending to care. Sharon knew that kind of gaze, the hollow, distracted look of a man hiding something, of someone avoiding accountability. And every time her eyes followed him out the door, she felt the dread in her stomach coil tighter, whispering that the case was more compromised than she had realized. Meanwhile, at the ranch, Victor Newman stood near the window overlooking the sprawling Newman property, a kingdom that had survived betrayal, corporate warfare, and family implosions, but nothing rattled him quite like the storm brewing now. When Adam Newman arrived, his stride was tense, determined, carrying the weight of someone ready to plunge into another battle, another war brewed in secrecy and pride. The air vibrated with anticipation the moment Adam stepped inside, because both father and son knew their conversation would shape the next chapter of the Abbott-Newman conflict. Adam wasted no time and pressed forward with his question, asking if everything was truly in place to sabotage the launch of Abbott Communications, Billy Abbott's latest ambitious project that threatened to carve out a dangerous slice of Genoa City influence. Victor, with his hands clasped behind his back, released a slow breath before delivering the news that Jill Abbott had outright denied holding any ownership in the company. He had offered her more than a generous payout, well above market value, yet she refused to admit to possessing even a fraction of the shares Adam insisted she had. Adam's jaw clenched, his frustration simmering beneath his calm tone as he insisted he had proof Jill was lying. And in typical Adam fashion, he hinted at the possibility that Jill was protecting someone, Sally Spectra, perhaps. The way he said her name carried a bitter edge, one that revealed far more than he intended. Victor watched him carefully, absorbing every nuance, every drop of insecurity swirling beneath Adam's determination. When Adam suggested delaying the offensive against Jabot, Victor nodded, not because he wanted to, but because calculating patience had always been part of his legendary strategy. And yet, even as they discussed tactics, Victor sensed that his son's motivations were tangled, part ambition, part jealousy, part fear that Billy Abbott was rising faster than anyone anticipated. But while the Newman men plotted their offensive, another storm brewed quietly. One that would explode in far more personal, far more devastating ways. Harrison Abbott, the little boy with the keen eyes and curious heart, had been living in the shadow of emotional turbulence ever since Claire Newman wormed her way back into Kyle's world. Harrison adored his father, but even at his young age, he understood danger. He sensed lies the way dogs sensed storms. And Claire, no matter how softly she spoke or gently she smiled, made his skin crawl. It wasn't jealousy or childish stubbornness. It was intuition. Harrison saw what others missed. He saw the cracks in Claire's mask, the twitch behind her smile, the sharpness in her voice when she thought no one was listening. And now, after witnessing Claire's true self in the worst possible way during that disastrous kiss with Kyle, Harrison carried the truth like a fire in his chest. He wasn't just wary of Claire. He was ready to expose her again, ready to pull the truth into daylight no matter how uncomfortable it made the adults. So when Kyle ran into Claire at Crimson Lights, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Claire was too calm, too rehearsed, her eyes bright with a kind of brittle cheerfulness that felt almost artificial. She spoke lightly, asking about Thanksgiving, encouraging Kyle to spend it with his family as if nothing chaotic, nothing dangerous had occurred between them. The duplicity in her voice made the conversation feel surreal, like stepping into a play where the actors were pretending not to know the script had already been rewritten in blood and betrayal. Kyle, shaken from everything that had happened, tried to keep his composure. He listened, nodded, and carefully chose his words, but he wasn't falling for Claire's renewed sweetness. Not this time. So when she suggested he bring her along, "Why don't you swing by?" Kyle refused the invitation and instead told her she should bring the idea directly to the Abbotts if she wanted to attend. He expected her to back down. Instead, Claire smiled with unsettling confidence, insisting she would stop by for half an hour, as if she believed she still had a place at their table, as if she hadn't detonated the fragile equilibrium of their home. Kyle walked away from the conversation with a tightness in his chest he couldn't shake. Something about Claire's demeanor had shifted. Her eyes held a gleam that made him uneasy, a determination that wasn't about reconciliation but about intrusion. And deep down, he felt the first ripple of dread that perhaps Claire still believed she had a claim on him, on their family, on Harrison. That she wouldn't accept the truth, that Kyle wanted nothing more to do with her. And Kyle's fears weren't misplaced. Harrison had been monitoring Claire with the vigilance of someone who understood the stakes intuitively. He didn't trust her sudden calmness. He didn't trust her sugar-coated apology. And he certainly didn't trust the way she insisted she would visit the Abbotts for Thanksgiving. Harrison felt a nervous flutter in his stomach each time he pictured Claire stepping into their home again. Something terrible clung to the edges of his instincts, something dark and threatening. Something he couldn't fully describe but could feel creeping closer. And he knew, without a shred of doubt, that Claire was planning something. He could see it in the way she watched Kyle. In the way she seemed to wander near their house. In the way she carried herself with that painfully polite, dangerously fragile composure. Back at the ranch, Victor observed Adam with a cold, calculating gaze. He could sense something shifting not only in business, but in the heart of the Newman family. The chaos surrounding Claire, Harrison, Kyle, and Sharon was beginning to bleed into other corners of their lives. And Victor, whose instincts rivaled Sharon's in sharpness, could feel a larger battle looming. A battle that had little to do with corporate warfare and everything to do with protecting the bloodline he'd dedicated his life to building. The Abbotts, the Newmans, the families tethered together by decades of rivalry and consequence. All were circling closer to a collision point that threatened to rip open every secret simmering beneath Genoa City's surface. And Claire Newman, with her fractured mind and her escalating desperation, was about to pour gasoline on the fire. She lingered in the shadows of crimson lights after Kyle left, stirring sugar into a mug she never intended to drink. Her mind churned with a frenzy of emotions, anger, longing, humiliation, and a deep, gnawing need to reclaim control. She couldn't stand that Kyle had spoken to her with caution instead of affection. She couldn't stand that Sharon watched her with suspicion. She couldn't stand that Harrison, just a child, had become the barrier that prevented her from wrapping her fingers around Kyle's future. And now, with Thanksgiving approaching, Claire saw an opportunity. A window. A moment where families gathered, where doors remained unlocked, where distractions were inevitable. Thanksgiving was a holiday meant for unity. Claire intended to use it for vengeance. She replayed her conversation with Kyle over and over, twisting each word until it fueled her desperation. He may have refused her invitation, but she heard something else beneath his tone: weakness, vulnerability, fear. And Claire believed, with every unraveling thread of her mind, that fear meant he still cared. That fear meant she still had a chance. That fear meant she could still control him. But Harrison knew better. He sensed Claire watching him. He felt her eyes following him as he left the coffee shop. And for the first time in his young life, he considered telling someone what he had noticed. But who would understand? Who would listen? His father was overwhelmed. His grandmother was preoccupied. His family was fractured. And Claire, dangerously unpredictable Claire, knew how to mask her intentions too well. Still, Harrison felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders, forcing him to remain vigilant. Because he knew the truth, Claire Newman was not finished. She was only reorganizing her attack. And he sensed, in the way only a child could, that if no one stopped her soon, she would strike again. And this time, she would strike harder. As Thanksgiving approached, the tension in Genoa City thickened. Victor prepared for war against Billy. Sharon stalked Detective Burroughs' every misstep. Adam sharpened his focus on corporate sabotage. And Kyle, unaware of how close danger hovered around him, tried to prepare his family for what was supposed to be a peaceful holiday. But Claire wasn't preparing for peace. She was preparing for her comeback. And the person she intended to confront first, the person she intended to crush, silence, or remove, was Harrison Abbott. Thanksgiving at the Newman Ranch had always been an event wrapped in tradition, elegance, and the carefully controlled tension of a family famous for surviving wars both personal and corporate, but this year the air carried an unease that none of them fully understood. Victor Newman stood near his desk as Adam finished outlining the next step in their quiet campaign against Billy Abbott, and for once, father and son found themselves agreeing strategically. Something rare enough to make the moment feel historic. Victor announced, with his usual unshakable authority, that he still intended to move forward despite Jill's claims, and Adam opened his mouth to argue further when the door opened and all strategy evaporated under the shift of energy brought on by the entrance of Nikki, Victoria, and Chelsea. Victoria walked in first, composed but carrying an undercurrent of something Victor couldn't quite read, exhaustion perhaps, or guarded hope. She cut into the business conversation with a light but intentional tone, saying she hoped no one would mind that she invited Nate Hastings to join them for cocktails after dinner. Nikki, ever gracious, smiled and answered instantly with a warm of course, but Victor frowned, narrowing his eyes at the speed of her acceptance. He turned to Victoria with the suspicion of a man who'd lived long enough to interpret even the subtlest shift in his daughter. "Since when are you suddenly close to that young man again?" he asked, and Victoria's pause lasted just long enough to reveal that the answer wasn't simple. Eventually she replied that Nate had helped her through a very painful chapter in her life, and she hoped, at the very least, that he would be civil and respectful. The subtext hung in the air: Victoria needed support, and Nate had provided it whether Victor approved or not. But the moment between them was abruptly interrupted as Claire walked in, her expression polite but unreadable, announcing that she intended to stop by the Abbott mansion for a little while before dinner. Nikki, unaware of the subtle tension beneath Claire's smile and blissfully ignorant of the emotional carnage Claire had caused for Kyle and Harrison, casually encouraged her to bring along an extra pumpkin pie because they were overloaded with food. To Nikki, Claire was a young woman trying to rebuild her life. To Victor, she was a potential liability he'd never quite been able to trust. And to Victoria, well, Claire was family now, whether she liked it or not. Meanwhile, across Genoa City, at Society, the pre-Thanksgiving chaos had already begun. Sally Spectra stood near the counter with her arms folded, growing increasingly impatient as she and Billy waited for the pumpkin pie Jack had ordered for the family gathering. Sally muttered under her breath that she should have just made one herself, but Billy, amused and already in holiday mode, teased her by saying she could never bake enough pies to satisfy this family anyway. Sally rolled her eyes, but there was affection underneath the annoyance. She'd tried so hard to win the Abbotts' acceptance, and showing up late with a missing dessert was not how she wanted to start the day. When they finally arrived at the Abbott estate, hands full of warm pumpkin pies and mild annoyance, Diane and Tracy greeted them at the door. Diane's polite smile tightened at the sight of not one, but two pies, and the moment grew instantly awkward when both Sally and Billy extended their offerings at the exact same time. Tracy's laughter softened the tension, but even she couldn't hide her amusement at their overcompensation. The Abbott Thanksgiving, filled with decades of complicated relationships, needed no additional layers of irony. Upstairs, Kyle ran a hand through his hair as he checked his watch. He was running later than he wanted, his mind still spinning from the complicated swirl of emotions Claire had dredged up earlier in the week. He hated how exhausted he felt. He hated the anxiety clawing at him every time Claire's name entered a conversation. Mostly, he hated that Harrison had sensed every moment of distress before he could hide it. When Kyle finally arrived, Harrison heard his father's voice from the foyer and bolted down the stairs with the kind of enthusiasm only a child could muster, pure, uninhibited devotion. Kyle crouched, scooping his son into his arms, burying his face in Harrison's hair for a moment longer than usual because the world outside that embrace felt unstable and unpredictable. Harrison squeezed him tight, as if he too felt the creeping unease of the day. Then the moment Kyle feared and expected arrived. Claire appeared at the door, holding Nikki's requested pumpkin pie, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Kyle, then on Harrison. There was a small smile on her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. Diane nudged Tracy and whispered dryly that pumpkin pie seemed to be the new fruitcake this year. Tracy stifled a giggle, but Kyle's stomach dropped. Claire stepped forward, her voice soft and harmless, greeting Harrison with the sweetness she always used to mask her deeper intentions. She told him she could only stay for a short while, perhaps 30 minutes at most. Harrison blinked, hesitated, and then, shocking Kyle, stepped forward and tugged gently at Claire's sleeve, begging her to stay for dinner. Everyone froze. Kyle's breath caught painfully in his chest. Harrison's plea wasn't born from affection. Kyle could see the fear behind his son's eyes. It wasn't a request, it was a warning disguised as a child's invitation. Harrison wanted her where he could see her. Where Kyle could see her. Where Claire couldn't slip away and weave another plan in the shadows. Claire looked down at Harrison, and for a brief moment, something sinister flickered across her expression, too quick for anyone but Harrison to catch. Then she smiled again, tilting her head, pretending to consider the innocent request. Diane, trying to ease tension she didn't fully understand, chirped that there was plenty of food and that no one minded an extra guest on Thanksgiving. Billy, oblivious, encouraged her to stay. Tracy offered reassuring warmth, ever the peacekeeper. But Kyle's heart hammered painfully in his chest. He felt the shift the moment Claire stepped inside, the air tightening, his instincts screaming, every protective urge in him snapping awake. He watched Claire, watched the way she held herself, watched the way she calculated the room with careful little glances. She wasn't here to celebrate Thanksgiving. She wasn't here to heal old wounds. She was here with a purpose. And for the first time, Claire hesitated, not because she didn't want to stay, but because staying too long might reveal the very thing she didn't want anyone to suspect. Her plan hadn't been fully set in motion. Too many eyes. Too many voices. Too much warmth surrounding Kyle and Harrison. For a moment, Claire stood at the center of the Abbott living room, holding her pie, holding her breath, holding a secret that throbbed beneath her skin like a pulse. Harrison tugged her sleeve again. "Stay," he whispered softly, but Kyle heard the tremor underneath. Claire's smile sharpened. Her eyes softened with something almost tender, but twisted, fragile, dangerous. And she made her decision. Because if she stayed, even briefly, she could assess the room. She could watch where Harrison went. She could map the layout of the house, the exits, the weak points. She could calculate the perfect opportunity. So Claire breathed in slowly, turned toward Kyle and the Abbotts with perfect poise, and said, "Just for a little while." But Kyle felt the dread coil inside him like a living thing. And Harrison, standing so small, but so brave, felt something else. A cold certainty. Claire wasn't staying because she cared. She was staying because she was planning her next move. And whatever she planned, it would not end peacefully. Los Angeles always felt like a city built on illusions, a place where bright lights and glamour did little to drown out the darkness lurking in its forgotten corners. It was in that very darkness that Sharon and Nick Newman now found themselves standing, the wind brushing across cracked pavement outside a structure that barely resembled a building anymore, its walls crumbling, its windows dusty and broken, its presence exuding an eerie history of abandonment. The shadows clung to the outline of the structure like a second skin, and Sharon felt a chill crawl up her spine as her eyes scanned the entrance. She wasn't afraid of ruins, but she was afraid of what they might find inside. And Nick, he stood rigid, fists clenched, eyes sharp, breathing shallow, as if fighting the ghosts of a memory that had been clawing at him all morning. That memory hit Sharon first, rushing back in vivid detail. The moment Nick barged into her hotel room in a rage, his entire body trembling with fear and adrenaline. Matt Clark had been there. Smirking. Taunting. Proud of his own cruelty. Nick hadn't even spoken before he snapped, launching forward and shoving Matt violently against the wall, his hands wrapping around the man's throat with the desperation of a father pushed beyond breaking. Sharon could hear the sound of it again. The thud of Matt's back hitting the plaster, the strangled gasp from his lips, the way Nick's muscles tightened like coiled steel. She remembered the panic rising inside her, her voice trembling as she screamed, "Nick! Stop! We need him to tell us where Noah is." She had grabbed Nick's wrists, begging him to let go, fearing he would snap Matt's neck before they ever learned what happened to their son. When Nick had finally willed himself to loosen his grip, Matt slid down the wall like a puppet whose strings had been cut. And instead of coughing or panicking or showing any sign of fear, he laughed. A low, sinister chuckle that slithered through the room like poison. His eyes sparkled with madness as he told them Noah and Sienna Bacall were perfectly safe, a statement so calm, so casual, it felt more like a threat than a reassurance. "This is my game," Matt hissed, wiping a smear of blood from the corner of his lip. "I make the rules. I decide how this ends." The words had burned into Sharon's mind. Then Matt reached into his pocket, holding up a tiny bag of fentanyl as if it were a party favor, not a lethal weapon. He tossed it lightly toward Nick, who barely managed to catch it, staring at the packet with horror. "Consider it leverage," Matt said. "You'll need it if you ever want to see your son again." Fentanyl opens doors. Makes people talk. Helps you level the playing field. Then he scribbled an address onto a torn scrap of paper, something so crude it looked like it was ripped from the back of a coffee shop receipt. He pressed it into Nick's palm, leaned in close, and whispered, "Go there. And pray you're not too late." And then he walked out the door with a smile. Now, standing outside the abandoned building the scrap of paper had led them to, Nick replayed those moments in his mind, each memory twisting deeper into him like a blade. Sharon studied him, seeing the strain etched across his face, the pain of a father desperate to save his child, the fury of a man forced to rely on the whispers of a sociopath. She moved closer, reaching gently for his arm, grounding him as she had so many times before. But Nick's concentration broke only when he noticed something half buried in the dirt near the doorway. A plastic glint. He crouched quickly, brushing away grime and debris, and when he lifted it to the fading afternoon light, his throat tightened. It was a fentanyl pouch. Small. Identical to the one Matt had handed him in the hotel room. His stomach lurched. "Sharon," Nick whispered, holding up the tiny bag, "he used it. Matt used this on Noah." The horror in Sharon's eyes expanded instantly. Raw, wide, terrified, but before she could respond, the crunch of footsteps behind them snapped their attention toward the parking lot. Detective Burrows and Detective Annie Stewart approached, their badges glinting faintly beneath the dim light. Stewart moved with determination, her eyes scanning the area with sharp focus. Burrows, as usual, looked calm, too calm. Nick straightened, anger igniting in his eyes as he demanded, "You're here to help us find Noah, right?" His voice wavered between threat and plea. Stewart nodded firmly, saying they would do everything they could. Burrows echoed her words, but his tone carried an emptiness that made Sharon's skin prickle. The unease she had been feeling about him for days intensified, like pressure building behind her ribs. Nick handed the fentanyl pouch to Stuart, who examined it carefully as she exhaled a sharp breath. "This is bad," she muttered. "If Matt is using this stuff to control the situation, we're running out of time." Nick didn't hesitate. He motioned for Stuart to follow him and headed toward the entrance of the building. The structure creaked under the shifting wind, each groan sounding like a warning, but Nick didn't care. His son could be inside. And if there was even a 1% chance Noah was in this decayed shell, he was going to tear down every wall with his bare hands if necessary. Stuart followed, weapon drawn, flashlight ready. Sharon remained behind with Burroughs. And that was when everything inside her snapped into clarity. She turned sharply toward him, her breath unsteady, her voice trembling but filled with fierce certainty. "Do you really want to find Noah?" she demanded. Burroughs blinked, his expression tightening ever so slightly. Sharon stepped closer, her eyes burning. "Tell me the truth. Can we trust you? Because I cannot shake the feeling that you're hiding something." The air thickened. Burroughs looked at her, too calmly, too steadily. And Sharon felt the chill crawl deeper into her bones. Because in that moment, she realized something terrifying. Burroughs didn't look offended. He looked exposed. As if she had finally spoken aloud the one question he never wanted to hear.